Thank God. What a mare's nest! Or more grimly, what a rehearsal. It is only 24 hours since I got Betty's wire, and already the crisis seems curiously far away, like at sea. Once you have doubled the point and got into smooth water, the point doesn't take long to hide below the horizon. And now, Yoletta, I'm not at all surprised at your feeling flattened rather than joyful. That isn't ingratitude. It's only exhaustion. Weren't there moments even during those terrible days when you glided into a sort of apathy for the same reason? The body, bless it, will not continue indefinitely supplying us with the physical media of emotion. Surely there's no difficulty about the prayer in Gethsemane on the ground, that if the disciples were asleep, they couldn't have heard it, and therefore couldn't have recorded it. The words they did record would hardly have taken 3 seconds to utter. He was only a stone's throw away. The silence of night was around them, and we may be sure he prayed aloud. People did everything aloud in those days. You remember how astonished St. Augustine was, some centuries later, in a far more sophisticated society, to discover that when St. Ambrose was reading to himself, you couldn't hear the words even if you went and stood just beside him. The disciples heard the opening words of the prayer before they went to sleep. They record those opening words as if they were the whole. There's a rather amusing instance of the same thing in Acts 24. The Jews had got down a professional orator called Tertullus to conduct the prosecution of St. Paul. The speech, as recorded by St. Luke, takes 84 words in the Greek, if I've counted correctly. 84 words are impossibly short for a Greek advocate on a full-dress occasion. Presumably then, they are a précis, but of those 80-odd words, 40 are taken up with preliminary compliments to the bench, stuff which, in a précis on that tiny scale, ought not to have come in at all. It is easy to guess what has happened. St. Luke, though an excellent narrator, was no good as a reporter. He starts off by trying to memorize, or to get down, the whole speech verbatim, and he succeeds in reproducing a certain amount of the exordium, the style unmistakable. Only a practicing rhetoric ever talks that way. But he is soon defeated. The whole of the rest of the speech has to be represented by a ludicrously inadequate abstract. But he doesn't tell us what has happened, and thus seems to attribute to Tertullus a performance which would have spelled professional ruin. As you say, the problems about prayer which really press upon a man when he is praying for dear life are not the general and philosophical ones. They are those that arise within Christianity itself. At least, this is so for you and me. We have long since agreed that if our prayers are granted at all, they are granted from the foundation of the world. God and his acts are not in time. Intercourse between God and man occurs at particular moments for the man, but not for God. If there is, as the very concept of prayer presupposes, an adaptation between the free actions of men in prayer and the course of events, this adaptation is from the beginning inherent in the great single creative act. Our prayers are heard. Don't say have been heard, or you are putting God into time, not only before we make them, but before we are made ourselves. The real problems are different. Is it our faith that prayers, or some prayers, are real causes? But they are not magical causes. They don't, like spells, act directly on nature. They act then on nature through God. This would seem to imply that they act on God. But God, we believe, is impassible. All theology would reject the idea of a transaction in which a creature was the agent and God the patient. It is quite useless to try to answer this empirically by producing stories, though you and I could tell strange ones, of striking answers to prayer. We shall be told reasonably enough that post hoc is not propter hoc. The thing we prayed for was going to happen anyway. Our action was irrelevant. Even a fellow creature's action which fulfills our request may not be caused by it. He does what we ask, but perhaps he would equally have done so without our asking. Some cynics will tell us that no woman ever married a man because he proposed to her. She always elicits the proposal because she has determined to marry him. In these human instances, we believe, when we do believe, that our request was the cause or a cause of the other party's action, because we have, from deep acquaintance, a certain impression of that party's character. Certainly not by applying the scientific procedures, control experiments, etc., for establishing causes. Similarly, we believe, when we do believe, that the relation between our prayer and the event is not a mere coincidence, only because we have a certain idea of God's character. Only faith vouches for the connection. No empirical proof could establish it. Even a miracle, if one occurred, might have been going to happen anyway. Again, in the most intimate human instances, we really feel that the category of cause and effect will not contain what actually happens. In a real proposal, as distinct from one in an old-fashioned novel, is there any agent-patient relation? Which drop on the window pane moves to join the other? Now, I am going to suggest that strictly causal thinking is even more inadequate when applied to the relation between God and man. I don't mean only when we are thinking of prayer, but whenever we are thinking about what happens at the frontier, at the mysterious point of junction and separation, where absolute being utters derivative being. One attempt to define causally what happens there has led to the whole puzzle about grace and free will. You will notice that Scripture just sails over the problem. Work out your own salvation in fear and trembling. Pure Pelagianism. But why? For it is God who worketh in you. Pure Augustinianism. It is presumably only our presuppositions that make this appear nonsensical. We profanely assume that divine and human action exclude one another like the actions of two fellow creatures, so that God did this and I did this cannot both be true of the same act, except in the sense that each contributed a share. In the end, we must admit a two-way traffic at the junction. At first sight, no passive verb in the world would seem to be so utterly passive as to be created. Does it not mean to have been non-entity? Yet, for us rational creatures, to be created also means to be made agents. We have nothing that we have not received, but part of what we have received is the power of being something more than receptacles. We exercise it, no doubt, chiefly by our sins. But they, for my present argument, will do as well as anything else, for God forgives sins. He would not do so if we committed none. Whereto serves mercy, but to confront the visage of offence? In that sense, the divine action is consequent upon, conditioned by, elicited by our behavior. Does this mean that we can act upon God? I suppose you could put it that way if you wanted. If you do, then we must interpret his impassibility in a way which admits this. For we know that God forgives much better than we know what impassible means. I would rather say that from before all worlds, his providential and creative act, for they are all one, takes into account all the situations produced by the acts of his creatures. And if he takes our sins into account, why not our petitions? I see your point, but you must admit that Scripture doesn't take the slightest pains to guard the doctrine of divine impassibility. We are constantly represented as exciting the divine wrath or pity, even as grieving God. I know this language is analogical, but when we say that, we must not smuggle in the idea that we can throw the analogy away and, as it were, get in behind it to a purely literal truth. All we can really substitute for the analogical expression is some theological abstraction. And the abstraction's value is almost entirely negative. It warns us against drawing absurd consequences from the analogical expression by prosaic extrapolations. By itself, the abstraction impassible can get us nowhere. It might even suggest something far more misleading than the most naif Old Testament picture of a stormily emotional Jehovah. Either something inert or something which was pure act, in such a sense that it could take no account of events within the universe it had created. I suggest two rules for exegetics. 1. Never take the images literally. 2. When the purport of the images, what they say to our fear and hope and will and affections, seems to conflict with the theological abstractions, trust the purport of the images every time. For our abstract thinking is itself a tissue of analogies, a continual modeling of spiritual reality in legal or chemical or mechanical terms. Are these likely to be more adequate than the sensuous, organic, and personal images of Scripture, light and darkness, river and well, seed and harvest, master and servant, hen and chickens, father and child? The footprints of the divine are more visible in that rich soil than across rocks or slag heaps. Hence what they now call demythologizing Christianity can easily be remythologizing it and substituting a poorer mythology for a richer. I agree that my deliberately vague expression about our prayers being taken into account is a retreat from Pascal's magnificent dictum. God has instituted prayer so as to confer upon his creatures the dignity of being causes. But Pascal really does suggest a far too explicit agent and patient relation, with God as the patient. And I have another ground for preferring my own more modest formula. To think of our prayers as just causes would suggest that the whole importance of petitionary prayer lay in the achievement of the thing asked for. But really, for our spiritual life as a whole, the being taken into account or considered matters more than the being granted. Religious people don't talk about the results of prayer. They talk of its being answered or heard. Someone said, "A suitor wants his suit to be heard as well as granted." In suits to God, if they are really religious acts at all and not merely attempts at magic, this is even more so. We can bear to be refused, but not to be ignored. In other words, our faith can survive many refusals if they really are refusals and not mere disregards. The apparent stone will be bread to us if we believe that a Father's hand put it into ours, in mercy or in justice or even in rebuke. It is hard and bitter, yet it can be chewed and swallowed. But if, having prayed for our heart's desire and got it, we then became convinced that this was a mere accident, that providential designs which had only some quite different end just couldn't help throwing out this satisfaction for us as a byproduct, then The apparent bread would become a stone, a pretty stone perhaps, or even a precious stone, but not edible to the soul. What we must fight against is Pope's maxim, the first almighty cause, acts not by partial, but by general laws. The odd thing is that Pope thought, and all who agree with him think, that this philosophical theology is an advance beyond the religion of the child and the savage and the New Testament. It seems to them less naive and anthropomorphic. The real difference, however, is that the anthropomorphism is more subtly hidden and of a far more disastrous type. For the implication is that there exists, on the divine level, a distinction with which we are very familiar on our own, that between the plan, or the main plan, and its unintended but unavoidable byproducts, whatever we do, even if it achieves its object, will also scatter round it a spray of consequences which were not its object at all. This is so even in private life. I throw out crumbs for the birds and provide, incidentally, a breakfast for the rats. Much more so in what may be called managerial life. The governing body of the college alters the time of dinner in hall, our object being to let the servants get home earlier. But by doing so, we alter the daily pattern of life for every undergraduate. To some, the new arrangement will be a convenience, to others the reverse. But we had no special favor for the first lot, and no spite against the second. Our arrangement drags these unforeseen and undesired consequences after it. We can't help this. On Pope's view, God has to work in the same way. He has his grand design for the sum of things. Nothing we can say will deflect it. It leaves him little freedom, or none, for granting or even for deliberately refusing our prayers. The grand design churns out innumerable blessings and curses for individuals. God can't help that. They're all byproducts. I suggest that the distinction between plan and byproducts vanish entirely on the level of omniscience, omnipotence, and perfect goodness. I believe this because even on the human level, it diminishes the higher you go. The better a human plan is made, the fewer unconsidered byproducts it will have, and the more birds it will kill with one stone, the more diverse needs and interests it will meet. The nearer it will come, it can never come very near, to being a plan for each individual. Bad laws make hard cases. But let us go beyond the managerial altogether. Surely a man of genius composing a poem or symphony must be less unlike God than a ruler. But the man of genius has no mere byproducts in his work. Every note or word will be more than a means, more than a consequence. Nothing will be present solely for the sake of other things. If each note or word were conscious, it would say, "The Maker had me myself in view and chose for me, with the whole force of his genius, exactly the context I required." And it would be right, provided it remembered that every other note or word could say no less. How should the true Creator work by general laws? To generalize is to be an idiot, said Blake. Perhaps he went too far. But to generalize is to be a finite mind. Generalities are the lenses with which our intellects have to manage. How should God sully the infinite lucidity of this vision with such makeshifts? One might as well think he had to consult books of reference, or that if he ever considered me individually, he would begin by saying, "Gabriel, bring me Mr. Lewis's file." The God of the New Testament, who takes into account the death of every sparrow, is not more, but far less anthropomorphic than Pope's. I will not believe in the managerial God and his general laws. If there is providence at all, everything is providential, and every providence is a special providence. It is an old and pious saying that Christ died not only for man, but for each man, just as much as if each had been the only man there was. Can I not believe the same of this creative act, which, as spread out in time, we call destiny or history? It is for the sake of each human soul. Each is an end, perhaps for each beast, perhaps even each particle of matter. The night sky suggests that the inanimate also has for God some value we cannot imagine. His ways are not there anyway, like ours. If you ask why I believe all this, I can only reply that we are taught both by precept and example to pray, and that prayer would be meaningless in the sort of universe Pope pictured. One of the purposes for which God instituted prayer may have been to bear witness that the course of events is not governed like a state, but created like a work of art to which every being makes its contribution, and in prayer a conscious contribution, and in which every being is both an end and a means. And since I have momentarily considered prayer itself as a means, let me hasten to add that it is also an end. The world was made partly that there might be prayer, partly that our prayers for George might be answered. But let's have finished with partly. The great work of art was made for the sake of all it does and is, down to the curve of every wave and the flight of every insect. I am all in favor of your idea that we should go back to our old plan of having a more or less set subject, an agendum for our letters. When we were last separated, the correspondence languished for lack of it. How much better we did in our undergraduate days with our interminable letters on the Republic and classical meters, and what was then the new psychology. Nothing makes an absent friend so present as a disagreement. Prayer, which you suggest, is a subject that is a good deal in my mind. I mean private prayer. If you are thinking of corporate prayer, I won't play. There is no subject in the world, always excepting sport, on which I have less to say than liturgiology, and the almost nothing which I have to say may as well be disposed of in this letter. I think our business as laymen is to take what we are given and make the best of it. And I think we should find this a great deal easier if what we were given was always and everywhere the same. To judge from their practice, very few Anglican clergymen take this view. It looks as if they believe people can be lured to go to church by incessant brightenings, lightenings, lengthenings, abridgments, simplifications, and complications of the service. And it is probably true that a new keen vicar will usually be able to form within his parish a minority who are in favor of his innovations. The majority, I believe, never are. Those who remain, many give up church-going altogether, merely endure. Is this simply because the majority are hidebound? I think not. They have a good reason for their conservatism. Novelty, simply as such, can have only an entertainment value, and they don't go to church to be entertained. They go to use the service, or, if you prefer, to enact it. Every service is a structure of acts and words through which we receive a sacrament, or repent, or supplicate, or adore. And it enables us to do these things best. If you like, it works best when, through long familiarity, we don't have to think about it. As long as you notice and have to count the steps You are not yet dancing, but only learning to dance. A good shoe is a shoe you don't notice. Good reading becomes possible when you need not consciously think about eyes, or light, or print, or spelling. The perfect church service would be one we were almost unaware of. Our attention would have been on God. But every novelty prevents this. It fixes our attention on the service itself, and thinking about worship is a different thing from worshiping. The important question about the Grail was, for what does it serve? 'Tis mad idolatry that makes the service greater than the God. A still worse thing may happen. Novelty may fix our attention, not even on the service, but on the celebrant. You know what I mean. Try as one may to exclude it, the question, what on earth is he up to now, will intrude. It lays one's devotion waste. There is really some excuse for the man who said, I wish they'd remember that the charge to Peter was feed my sheep, not try experiments on my rats, or even teach my performing dogs new tricks. Thus my whole liturgiological position really boils down to an entreaty for permanence and uniformity. I can make do with almost any kind of service whatever, if only it will stay put. But if each form is snatched away just when I am beginning to feel at home in it, then I can never make any progress in the art of worship. You give me no chance to acquire the trained habit, habito dell'arte. It may well be that some variations, which seem to me merely matters of taste, really involve grave doctrinal differences, but surely not all. For if grave doctrinal differences are really as numerous as variations in practice, then we shall have to conclude that no such thing as the Church of England exists. And anyway, the liturgical fidget is not a purely Anglican phenomenon. I have heard Roman Catholics complain of it too. And that brings me back to my starting point. The business of us laymen is simply to endure and make the best of it. Any tendency to a passionate preference for one type of service must be regarded simply as a temptation. Partisan churchmanships are my bête noire. And if we avoid them, may we not possibly perform a very useful function? The shepherds go off, everyone to his own way, and vanish over diverse points of the horizon. If the sheep huddle patiently together and go on bleating, might they finally recall the shepherds? Haven't English victories sometimes been won by the rank and file in spite of the generals? As to the words of the service, liturgy in the narrower sense, the question is rather different. If you have a vernacular liturgy, you must have a changing liturgy. Otherwise, it will finally be vernacular only in name. The ideal of timeless English is sheer nonsense. No living language can be timeless. You might as well ask for a motionless river. I think it would have been best, if it were possible, that necessary change should have occurred gradually, and, to most people, imperceptibly, here a little and there a little, one obsolete word replaced in a century, like the gradual change of spelling in successive editions of Shakespeare. As things are, we must reconcile ourselves, if we can also reconcile government, to a new book. If we were, I thank my stars I'm not, in a position to give its authors advice, would you have any advice to give them? Mine could hardly go beyond unhelpful cautions. Take care. It is so easy to break eggs without making omelettes. Already, our liturgy is one of the very few remaining elements of unity in our hideously divided church. The good to be done by revision needs to be very great and very certain before we throw that away. Can you imagine any new book which will not be a source of new schism. Most of those who press for revision seem to wish that it should serve two purposes, that of modernizing the language in the interests of intelligibility and that of doctrinal improvement. Of the two operations, each painful and each dangerous to be carried out at the same time, will the patent survive? What are the agreed doctrines which are to be embodied in the new book, and how long will agreement on them continue? I ask with trepidation, because I read a man the other day who seemed to wish that everything in the old book which was inconsistent with orthodox Freudianism should be deleted. For whom are we to cater in revising the language? A country parson I know asked his sexton what he understood by indifferently in the phrase truly and indifferently administer justice. The man replied, "It means making no difference between one chap and another." "And what would it mean if it said impartially?" asked the parson. "Don't know. Never heard of it," said the sexton. "Here, you see, we have a change intended to make things easier. But it does so neither for the educated, who understand indifferently already, nor for the wholly uneducated, who don't understand impartially. It helps only some middle area of the congregation, which may not even be a majority. Let us hope the revisers will prepare for their work by a prolonged empirical study of popular speech as it actually is, not as we, a priori, assume it to be. How many scholars know, what I discovered by accident, that when uneducated people say impersonal, they sometimes mean incorporeal? What of expressions which are archaic but not unintelligible? Be ye lift up. I find that people react to archaism most diversely. It antagonizes some, makes what is said unreal. To others, not necessarily more learned, it is highly numinous and a real aid to devotion. We can't please both. I know there must be change. But is this the right moment? Two signs of the right moment occur to me. One would be a unity among us which enabled the Church, not some momentarily triumphant party, to speak through the new work with a united voice. The other would be the manifest presence somewhere in the Church of the specifically literary talent needed for composing a good prayer. Prose needs to be not only very good, but very good in a very special way, if it is to stand up to reiterated reading aloud. Cranmer may have his defects as a theologian, as a stylist. He can play all the moderns and many of his predecessors off the field. I don't see either sign at the moment. Yet, we all want to be tinkering. Even I would gladly see, "Let your light so shine before men," removed from the offertory. It sounds, in that context, so like an exhortation to do our alms, that they may be seen by men. I'd meant to follow up what you say about Rose Macaulay's letters, but that must wait till next week. Why, you say that my view of church services is man-centered and too concerned with mere edification. How does this follow from anything I said? Actually, my ideas about the sacrament would probably be called magical by a good many modern theologians. Surely the more fully one believes that a strictly supernatural event takes place, the less one can attach any great importance to the dress, gestures, and position of the priest. I agree with you that he is there not only to edify the people, but to glorify God. But how can a man glorify God by placing obstacles in the way of the people? Especially if the slightest element of clerical one-upmanship, I owe the phrase to a cleric, underlies some of his eccentricities. How right is that passage in the Imitation where the celebrant is told, "Consult not your own devotion, but the edification of your flock." I've forgotten how the Latin runs now about the Rose Macaulay letters. Like you, I was staggered by this continual search for more and more prayers. If she were merely collecting them as objets d'art, I could understand it. She was a born collector. But I get the impression that she collected them in order to use them, that her whole prayer life depended on what we may call ready-made prayers, prayers written by other people. But though, like you, staggered, I was not, like you, repelled. One reason is that I had, and you hadn't, the luck to meet her. Make no mistake, she was the right sort, one of the most fully civilized people I ever knew. The other reason, as I have so often told you, is that you are a bigot. Broaden your mind, Malcolm, broaden your mind. It takes all sorts to make a world, or a church. This may be even truer of a church. If grace perfects nature, it must expand all our natures into the full richness of the diversity which God intended when he made them, and heaven will display far more variety than hell. One fold doesn't mean one pool. Cultivated roses and daffodils are no more alike than wild roses and daffodils. What pleased me most about a Greek Orthodox Mass I once attended was that there seemed to be no prescribed behavior for the congregation. Some stood, some knelt, some sat, some walked. One crawled about the floor like a caterpillar. And the beauty of it was that nobody took the slightest notice of what anyone else was doing. I wish we Anglicans would follow their example. One meets people who are perturbed because someone in the next pew does or does not cross himself. They oughtn't even to have seen, let alone censured. Who art thou that judgest another's servant? I don't doubt, then, that Rose Macaulay's method was the right one for her. It wouldn't be for me any more than for you. All the same, I am not quite such a purist in this matter as I used to be. For many years after my conversion, I never used any ready-made forms except the Lord's Prayer. In fact, I tried to pray without words at all, not to verbalize the mental acts. Even in praying for others, I believe I tended to avoid their names and substituted mental images of them. I still think the prayer without words is the best, if one can really achieve it. But I now see that in trying to make it my daily bread, I was counting on a greater mental and spiritual strength than I really have. To pray successfully without words, one needs to be at the top of one's form. Otherwise, the mental acts become merely imaginative or emotional acts, and a fabricated emotion is a miserable affair. When the golden moments come, when God enables one really to pray without words, who but a fool would reject the gift? But he does not give it, anyway, not to me, day in, day out. My mistake was what Pascal, if I remember rightly, calls error of stoicism, thinking we can do always what we can do sometimes. And this, you see, makes the choice between ready-made prayers and one's own words rather less important for me than it apparently is for you. For me, words are, in any case, secondary. They are only an anchor, or, shall I say, they are the movements of a conductor's baton, not the music. They serve to canalize the worship or penitence or petition which might without them, such are our minds, spread into wide and shallow puddles. It does not matter very much who first put them together. If they are our own words, they will soon, by unavoidable repetition, harden into a formula. If they are someone else's, we shall continually pour into them our own meaning, At present, for one's practice changes, and I think ought to change, I find it best to make my own words the staple, but introduce a modicum of the ready-made. Writing to you, I need not stress the importance of the homemade staple. As Solomon said at the dedication of the temple, each man who prays knows the plague of his own heart, also the comforts of his own heart. No other creature is identical with me, no other situation identical with mine. Indeed, I myself and my situation are in continual change. A ready-made form can't serve for my intercourse with God any more than it could serve for my intercourse with you. This is obvious. Perhaps I shan't find it so easy to persuade you that the ready-made modicum has also its use. For me, I mean, I'm not suggesting rules for anyone else in the whole world. First, it keeps me in touch with sound doctrine. Left to oneself, one could easily slide away from the faith once given into a phantom called my religion. Secondly, it reminds me what things I ought to ask, perhaps especially when I am praying for other people. The crisis of the present moment, like the nearest telegraph post, will always loom largest. Isn't there a danger that our great permanent objective necessities, often more important, may get crowded out? By the way, that's another thing to be avoided in a revised prayer book. Contemporary problems may claim an undue share, and the more up-to-date the book is, the sooner it will be dated. Finally, they provide an element of the ceremonial. On your view, that is just what we don't want. On mine, it is part of what we want. I see what you mean when you say that using ready-made prayers would be like making love to your own wife out of Petrarch or Donne. Incidentally, might you not quote them to such a literary wife as Betty? The parallel won't do. I fully agree that the relationship between God and a man is more private and intimate than any possible relation between two fellow creatures. Yes, but at the same time there is, in another way, a greater distance between the participants. We are approaching, well, I won't say the wholly other, for I suspect that is meaningless, but the unimaginably and insupportably other. We ought to be, sometimes I hope one is, simultaneously aware of closest proximity and infinite distance. You make things far too snug and confiding. Your erotic analogy needs to be supplemented by, I fell at his feet as one dead. I think the low church milieu that I grew up in did tend to be too cozily at ease in Sion. My grandfather, I'm told, used to say that he looked forward to having some very interesting conversations with St. Paul when he got to heaven. Two clerical gentlemen talking at ease in a club. It never seemed to cross his mind that an encounter